Okay. Well, today we're going to continue working on the listening section. And as it's our practice session, we're going to be practicing what we did yesterday, which is uh, lectures of the TOEFL listening. So remember that in this part of the test, you just listen to a lecture. A lecture is a university class. It's always going to be in an academic subject. So it could be a scientific topic, it could be literature, sociology. You listen to this lecture and then you get 6 questions about the lecture. You have to take notes. Yesterday we talked about how to take notes. So try to use that technique, at least for today's session. So you try it out, you see if it works. And we're going to be practicing that. So is that okay? Do you have any questions maybe before we start? Okay, great. Okay, let's start. Please get ready to take notes. And I'm going to be playing our first lecture. It says a lecture from a life sciences class. So it's
Listen to part of a lecture from a life sciences class. Raise your hand if you're right-handed. Yup, that looks typical. Most of us, about 90%, are right-handed. It's been that way throughout history. In nearly every culture, right has been associated with positive qualities, while the left has been associated with negative, or even evil ones. In Latin, left means sinister. In ancient Japan, men could reject or refuse to marry women who were left-handed. In modern China, teachers try to force left-handed students to learn to write with their right hands. And, as I'm sure all lefties know, everyday items like can openers, scissors, computer keyboards are designed for righties. In short, left-handers have been made to feel left out. Get it? It might seem straightforward to you and I, but scientifically speaking, the basis of handedness is not well understood. Most scientists define right-handed or left-handed on the basis of a person's preferred writing hand. But some scientists claim it should be based on the hand that is faster and more accurate in performing manual activities like tightening a screw or tying a knot. Still others claim that ability doesn't matter. In other words, that handedness should denote only preference. Yes, question.
What about people who are who use both hands?
You mean ambidextrous. Actually, most scientists agree that genuine ambidexterity is rare, and several of them believe it even rates its own special category as a distinct type of handedness. The reason for this is that most people can perform several functions relatively equal with either hand, which causes another scientific fraction to argue that there are actually only two types of handedness, right and non-right. This group advocates measuring handedness on a continuum from 100% right-handed to 100% left-handed. On this scale, we'd say something like, I'm 60% right-handed, or I'm 82.5% right-handed. Though how we'd determine who's more right-handed than another would open up a whole new can of worms. Okay, yes.
How do people become right-handed or left-handed in the first place? Does it come from your genes?
Mostly, yes. Research shows that handedness is largely genetic. Interestingly, though, even when both parents are left-handed, the odds are no better than 50-50 that their children will be lefties. Some scientists believe there is a specific gene that determines right-handedness, but the trouble is that they can't pinpoint it. They think this gene also aids in development of speech and language comprehension. Many researchers believe that handedness is a result of something called brain lateralization, which is the concept that each hemisphere of the brain controls different bodily functions. Researchers have long been believed that a person's dominant hand is on the opposite side of the brain hemisphere that controls their language specialization, so that right-handed people use the left half of their brain for processing language. But brain lateralization is not well documented, and there is evidence that seems to contradict this concept. For instance, while it's true that more than 90% of right-handed people do process language in their left hemisphere, recent research shows that about 40% of left-handed people also process language primarily in the left side of their brain. Additionally, only 10% of lefties rely primarily on their right brain to process language. So, what can we make of this? Though genetics clearly play a vital role in determining handedness, environment also seems to be an important factor. A recent archaeological study compared a group of modern Canadians with thousand-year-old skeletons from a British farming community. The Canadians showed right-handed dominance by a 9-to-1 ratio of larger right elbows than left ones. In the ancient skeletons, however, most right and left elbows were equal. Now, this doesn't prove that the British farmers were ambidextrous, but researchers say it does suggest that handedness can be subject to societal influence. So for many, the best hypothesis at this time is that handedness results from a complex interaction of nature and nurture.
Okay, so that was your lecture. It was about handedness, right? So let's take a look at the questions now. Our first question here says, what is the main topic of the lecture? What would you say?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's A or C.
Okay. That's actually interesting because, well, first of all, this is the main idea type of question. And it's asking you for the entire lecture, right? It says, what is the main topic of the lecture? So as you said, options A and C seem correct because they are in a way correct. Why? The definition of handedness was mentioned, and also handedness genetics was also mentioned. But you need to find one option that encompasses everything. Not just one of the things that were mentioned, because they talked about different things. They also talked about right-handed dominance when they started talking about different cultures and how right-handed people seem to dominate the world, right? Because everyday tools are made for right-handed people. Left-handed people have been excluded from society in a way. So A, B, and C, the three of them are things that were brought up in the lecture. However, if we have to make a choice about one that encompasses everything, I would say that would have to be option B, because the scientific basis of handedness includes all of the above, right? Includes the definition of handedness, the right-handed dominance, and genetics, because they don't just focus on genetics either. They talk about what determines handedness. And one thing that determines handedness was genetics, but another thing was also the environment. So I would say it's option D in that way. Okay, can you see why?
Yes, miss.
Okay, so careful. This is always a tricky question because they are going to include options that have been mentioned, things that have been mentioned, but you need to go for the one that talks about everything. So yes. Now our second question here says, why does the professor mention Japan and China?
Option D.
Option D, you said?
Yes, D.
To counter a point about handedness genetics. I don't think, what, do you have anything related to Japan and China in your notes?
I don't remember, but you mentioned a countries, and it's something related, I think.
Okay, but do you have anything written down about Japan and China in your notes?
No, miss.
Okay, so the professor actually mentions Japan and China in the beginning. We're gonna just see the transcript of this first part. In the introduction, actually, Japan and China were mentioned. So China and Japan. And they were talking about, they said, for example, in nearly every culture, right has been associated with positive qualities, while the left has been associated with negative or even evil ones. In Latin, left means sinister. In ancient Japan, men could reject or refuse to marry women who were left-handed. In modern China, teachers try to force left-handed students to learn to write with their right hands. And everyday items like an opener, scissors, computer keyboards are designed for writings. So when the professor mentions Japan and China, they're not talking about genetics, right? What would you say it is then?
Option C, miss.
Option C, exactly. All of those are handedness prejudices. Japan and China were examples of that. Okay. Now, our third question says, according to the professor, what was the problem with the concept of brain lateralization? It's a detailed question now.
Option A.
Okay, different parts of the brain control different body functions. Are you sure? Do you have anything in your notes about this? I mean, we're looking for a problem, right? I wouldn't say, if I had to guess, that option A is a problem, because brain lateralization, from what I remember, was a concept or a theory that said that what determines handedness, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, is your brain, so the hemisphere that you use the most and so forth. So if different parts of the brain control different body functions, I think that's a fact. It's not a problem, really. It's just a fact. It's something that's true, but it's not a problem. Same thing goes with option B. The same part of the brain controls all bodily functions. It's not a problem. That wouldn't be a problem either. I think the only options that we have for problems would be options C and D, right? It could have been that it has been disproven, or that it doesn't apply to determining handedness. So when was this mentioned? Was it mentioned when they were talking about archaeological studies, or was it mentioned when they were talking about what determines handedness?
Option C.
To be honest, I don't know. I don't think so, because I remember that the archaeological study was the one that found that like ancient people were ambidextrous. To be honest, I don't know, but I don't know. Let's see. Okay. Many researchers believe that handedness is a result of something called brain lateralization, which is the concept that each hemisphere of the brain controls different bodily functions. That's the concept of brain lateralization, right? The options that you were choosing. Researchers have long been believed that a person's dominant hand is on the side opposite of the brain hemisphere that controls their language specialization. So that right-handed people use the left half of the brain for processing language. But brain lateralization is not well documented, and there is evidence that seems to contradict this concept. For instance, while it's true that more than 90% of right-handed people do process language in their left hemisphere, Recent research shows that about 40% of left-handed people also process language primarily in their left side of the brain. Additionally, only 10% of lefties rely primarily on their right brain to process language. So basically, the problem is not that it has been disproven by an archaeological study, but because of the evidence, it's not well documented, right? So it doesn't seem to apply to determining handedness. It doesn't seem to be the answer to what determines handedness. Okay, curve. Now our next question says, why does the professor say this? I'm going to replay this part. Okay, so the question says, why does the professor say this?
Left-handers have been made to feel left out. Get it? It might seem fine for righties. In short, left-handers have been made to feel left out. Get it?
So the question is, why does the professor say get it? What does he mean? What would you say?
Option B, I think.
Yes, I do agree. He wants to direct students' attention to a pun. So a pun is a game of words, right? So he plays with the words. He says, left-handed people have been made to feel left out. So left-handers have been left out. So he's playing with the word left, using its two meanings. And when he says get it, he wants to direct the students' attention to that game of words that he made. So it's sort of a joke. You know, he's not like referring to any assignment. He's not asking or if the students can hear him or not. And he doesn't want to check if students are paying attention or not. Maybe he wants to check if students are paying attention to his jokes, to his joke, right? Or if they pay attention to that joke specifically. Now, question 5 says, in the lecture, the professor mentions problems that scientists have in determining handedness. Indicate which of the following statements is true. So what statement is true about a problem that scientists have in determining handedness? Another detailed question. What would you say?
Option B.
Okay, option D. Do you guys agree? About 90% of left-handers process language on the left side of their brains. I don't know. First of all, their left side of their left brains.
No, option B.
Option B, most science define handedness by manual performance accuracy. Would this be a problem though? If most scientists agreed on something, would it be a problem?
No, option A, I think it's
I'm sorry, which one?
option A.
Yeah, I think I do agree. Because the problem is that scientists don't agree on defining handedness. You know, first of all, they don't agree on defining handedness because some scientists claim that you have left-handed people, right-handed people, and ambidextrous people. Other scientists claim that there's only left and right-handed, and ambidextrous is something else, or that it's very rare. And other scientists claim that people are on either right or non-right, or I think they measure it on a scale, right? Like 90% left-handed. 20% right-handed. So that's one of the problems, that scientists don't agree on how to establish handedness. And then they have other things as well, but this is one of the problems. And it's the only thing that would make sense as well, because option D doesn't make sense. That wouldn't be a problem if most left-handed people would process language in their left side of the hemisphere, let's say, or on the left hemisphere, then that wouldn't be a problem. That would actually be the solution. Only 2% of all people are genuinely ambidextrous. That is, I think, true. The professor does mention that, but that's not the problem. That's not related to the problem. And option B doesn't make sense either, because that wouldn't be a problem if most scientists agree. And most scientists don't agree, so they don't define handedness by manual performance accuracy. Only a couple of them define it like that. So careful, sometimes it's about, if you're guessing, it's about trying to go for the logical answer. But of course, our goal here is for you guys to be able to listen to the lecture, take good notes, and understand at the same time, which is a challenge, but it's just practicing. Let's check our answers. I think they should all be correct. We have option D as the correct one here, option C, D. So everything's okay because we were correcting as we go. But careful, we'll continue practicing, but you guys need to practice on your own as well. Is this okay, guys? Do you have any questions so far?
No.
Okay, so let's do another one. Okay, guys, please get ready to take notes. I'm going to play the lecture. Listen to Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you guys couldn't hear. Let me see what's going on. Okay, I'm so sorry. Let me play it.
Listen to part of a university lecture on animal behavior by a professor of biology. We're looking at animal behavior this week, and let's turn now, class, to one of its most dramatic manifestations, animal mimicry. Organisms that are good to eat or that are attacked for other reasons often develop devices, through evolution of course, techniques and devices to protect themselves from their attackers in order to survive and in order to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation. And one of these techniques, one of these strategies, is to look like something else, to look like something that is not good to eat, or something that is otherwise of no interest to the predator. An organism that does this, that resembles something else, is called a mimic. And the thing that it has evolved to resemble is called the model, while the predator that it is trying to mislead is called the recipient, the one that receives the misleading image. Some mimics do this by adopting camouflage, which is a cryptic resemblance to something of no interest to its enemy. And by doing this, they become invisible. They are hidden. Many animals, insects, lizards, amphibians, mimic the abundant plant life in the habitat around them. I'm sure that you've seen green grasshoppers and brown moths that seem to be well hidden on grass stems and tree trunks when they're motionless. But the leaf-tailed gecko, a small lizard in Madagascar, is a master at this. It avoids its enemies by looking exactly like a cluster of old dead leaves. And there are various species of katydids, grasshopper-like insects that have managed to duplicate the appearance of leaves with startling accuracy. In all stages of growth, some species looking like fresh green leaves and others looking like old decaying leaves, complete with leaf veins, weathered edges, and mildew spots. These adaptations make these animals difficult or impossible for a predator to identify or even notice, and so these otherwise defenseless creatures are overlooked or passed by. Other organisms defend themselves directly with stings or bites, or with poisons or other noxious chemicals, and such organisms often assume bold, characteristic colors and markings, called warning coloration, that warns a predator, reminds it that this creature can inflict pain or discomfort, or that it tastes very bad. The bold orange and black pattern of the common monarch butterfly, or the black and yellow bands on a bumblebee are such warning colorations. And sometimes this warning coloration is so effective that another species, a species that doesn't have any of the protective devices of sting or poison or whatever, will adopt the same warning colors and pattern. This sort of mimicry is called Batesian mimicry. The name comes from the early zoologist H.W. Bates, who back in 1862 first suggested an explanation for the origins of mimicry based on Charles Darwin's new theory of natural selection. This was one of the earliest applications of Darwin's ideas to an unknown biological phenomenon. Now, viceroy butterflies taste good to many birds, but because they mimic the monarch butterfly's model's color pattern, because viceroy butterflies look like monarch butterflies, they are avoided, just like the monarch is. In the same way, many harmless fly species resemble the bumblebee model, and also in this way they avoid being eaten by the recipients, birds. So these are Bastian mimics. There are several conditions that must be fulfilled, though, for a Bastian mimic to be successful. The mimic must, of course, share the same general region and habitat as its model, but the mimic must also be less numerous than its model, which must be relatively abundant. That way, the odds are that the recipient predator will sample an unpalatable model first, which is very important for keeping the trick effective. A similar kind of mimicry is Mullerian mimicry, named after another early biologist. And in this sort of mimicry, both the model and the mimic are dangerous or taste bad. A very obvious example is the way that so many unrelated species of bees, wasps, and ants have assumed similar, bold, black and yellow, or black and orange banded patterns. By doing this, Mullerian mimics present a united image that predators soon learn to be weary of. There's also another aspect of mimicry that I'd like to mention too, and that's the mimicry used by predators. This is called aggressive mimicry, and it is used to conceal or misrepresent a predator until its prey comes near enough to capture. Many mantids, for example, are green or brown so that they blend in with their plant surroundings. But some tropical mantids are fantastically shaped and colored, like the beautiful orchid mantis, which resembles a petal of one of those tropical flowers, and it hides motionless next to one of these orchids until an insect comes within its reach. There are also several green-colored vine and grass snakes of various families, which lie invisible among the tangled vines and branches of the jungle until they suddenly lash out to grab their prey. Actually, there are an endless number of ingenious mimics in the natural world, and I recommend that you all try a Google Images search tonight for some more interesting examples of this fascinating behavior.
All right, guys, so let's go to the questions. Our first question says, why does the lecturer mention Charles Darwin? What do you guys think?
Option B.
Darwin's theory was used to explain mimicry. Yes, I do think it's option B as well, because obviously this lecture here was about animal mimicry. So everything needs to be related somehow to mimicry, right? In that case, option A couldn't be true at all, because this wasn't about the evolutionary theory, right? It's about mimicry, so it has to be related somehow. So yes, his theory was just to explain mimicry. I think that the person who explained mimicry for the first time based his theory on the recent discovery by Darwin related to natural selection. And the professor does talk about that. Okay. Now our next question here says, what is the term used, another detail, for an organism that is fooled by mimicry?
Option A.
Okay, do you guys agree? So yes, right, because we have three different terms. One was the mimic, the model, and the recipient. So yes, the one that is fooled by mimicry is the one that receives the mimicry, right? That's the recipient, the animal or the organism that is fooled. Usually attackers, right? But not always. The model is the animal or the thing, part of its environment that the animal is trying to imitate. And the mimic is the animal that does the mimicry, right? There's no device or prey. Now, our third question here says, why does the lecturer mention katydids? This is probably going to be an example, but it's an example of what? Or why does the professor mention? Why are katydids mentioned? I think katydids are mentioned as an example because this was a classification lecture, right? We have different types of mimicry. We had actually 4 different types. The first one was camouflage. What were the other ones? Do you guys remember?
Camouflage?
Sorry?
Camouflage? No.
Yes, camouflage was one. You think that katydids were an example of camouflage?
I don't know what is Katie Beats. I don't remember.
Okay. If you don't remember this having mentioned, then you just have to guess. If you have to guess, what I recommend is follow the order of things. The first type was camouflage. Do you remember what camouflage was? You should at least have an overall understanding of what each type is about. So do you remember how camouflage worked? What was camouflage? Camouflage, if you guys remember, was when the animal looks or blends in with its environment. When the animal looks like something from part of its environment. So if you guys had to guess, my recommendation would be assume that these katydids were an example if you don't know what they are, because if you know what they are, to be honest, this is easier. But if you don't know what katydids are and you don't remember them, the professor mentioning them, then guess. You would assume that katydids are an example of the first type, which is camouflage. And if you know that camouflage is about the animal hiding in its environment, then option D would be the one that makes more sense, right? Because camouflage is an animal that looks like something from its environment. So an animal that looks like leaves, for example. It's not about tasting bad or stinging. That's another type of mimicry. I think that's related to Mullerian mimicry or Batesian mimicry. But we are assuming that these katydids are examples of the first type, not the second or the third. And it's not an animal that looks like other animals. That's another type of mimicry as well. Now, katydids are like grasshoppers, son como saltamontes. So they do look like leaves and they are actually examples of camouflage. The professor says some mimics do this by adopting camouflage, which is a cryptic resemblance to something of no interest to its enemy. And by doing this, they become invisible. They are hidden. Many animals, insects, lizards, amphibians, mimic the abundant plant life in the habitat around. I'm sure that you've seen green grasshoppers and brown moths that seem to be well hidden on the grass, stems, and tree trunks, right? And then they mentioned the katydids. There are various species of katydids, grasshopper-like insects that have managed to duplicate the appearance of leaves. So katydids are an example of camouflage, and camouflage is when the animal hides in its environment. So these katydids look like leaves and they hide among leaves. So make sure that you at least get an understanding of the types and what they are and the examples. When you have classification, it's always like that. Now question 4 says, some moths and butterflies have large owl-like eye spots concealed under underwings, which they can suddenly display to a predator. Which kind of mimicry is this an example of? What would you guys say?
Option D.
Okay. Do you guys agree? Does everyone agree? Option D, you said? Aggressive mimicry, or option B, camouflage?
Option D.
Option D, aggressive. I don't know though. I think aggressive mimicry, if you guys remember, was when the attacker or when the predator imitates something else to attract the prey, right? That was aggressive mimicry. You guys remember? Let's see the transcript. So aggressive mimicry is, okay. There's also another aspect of mimicry that I'd like to mention, and that's the mimicry used by predators. Aggressive mimicry. It's used to conceal or misrepresent a predator until its prey comes near enough to capture. So the predators use this mimicry to catch their prey, to catch their food. But in this case, these moths and butterflies are not using mimicry in order to catch their prey. They're actually the prey, and they are using mimicry to escape from a predator, right? So I wouldn't say it's aggressive mimicry. And I don't think it's camouflage either, because we already had a question about camouflage. So it has to be option A or C. What do you guys think?
Option A.
Bayesian mimicry, maybe, to be honest, I'm not sure, but I do think it could be Bayesian. It's either Bayesian or Mullerian. Now, question 5 says, which organism is presented as an example of Mullerian?
Option C.
Yes, the monarch butterfly. Maybe, yeah, I think I do agree. The mantis is maybe the orchid mantis. The leaf-tailed gecko is not, right? That's mentioned.
It's option B. The mantis. Orchid mantis.
Okay. We'll see. And question 6 is the one that should be the main idea in the beginning, and it says, which would be the best title for this lecture?
Option D.
Animal escapades, maybe, because in a way, some animals use mimicry to escape from predators, but not all, right? We've already seen that there's, with aggressive mimicry, the predators use that to catch food. So I don't know.
Option C could be.
I do agree though, because remember that in this case, what you have to do is ask yourselves, what is the main topic of this lecture? It's animal mimicry, right? And you have to look for the closest one to that. What is mimicry? Mimicry is imitating something else in order to fool, para engañar, or in order to deceive another animal, right? That's mimicry. Imitating something else in order to deceive or to fool another animal. So it's like animal deception, right? That's the closest one I would say to animal mimicry, because it's about animal mimicry at the end, so we have to look for a synonym. Yes, I do agree. Deception means engaños, right? So it's the closest one. Let's now check our answers. The first one's correct. His theory was used to explain mimicry. Second one is also correct. The recipient is the term used for the organism that's fooled by it. The third one is correct as well. Katydids look like leaves. It was an example of camouflage. As for the fourth one, the moths and the butterflies are an example of Bayesian mimicry. That's correct. You were right. I honestly wasn't sure if it was Bayesian or Mullerian. But if you guys think about it, it makes sense that we had one question per subtopic, right? This question here was about Bayesian mimicry, and the next was about Mullerian. And this is also correct. The orchid mantis was used as an example for Mullerian. And finally, animal deception would be the best title for the lecture. So it's great. It was better than the previous one. We still had a couple of mistakes, mostly with detailed questions, but it's a matter of practicing again. Remember, when you guys have classification, which is very, very common, I am about 70% sure that you can get one classification because you get 3 lectures. So very likely that one of them will be types of something. So if you get something like this, the different types of something, you know that you need to identify the different types. So camouflage, Bayesian, Mullerian, and aggressive, what they are. This is really important, and I don't suggest that you guys take notes. look at this. If we play the lecture again, I want you guys to notice the structure. It's always the same, always the same. First, we have the introduction, the professor discusses the main topic and the main ideas, right, that are discussed in some options, like what animal mimicry is, for example. I don't suggest that you take notes on that. You shouldn't take notes on any of those big ideas, like what animal mimicry is. That those definitions, you don't have to take notes about that. You just pay attention to the introduction. You need to understand really well what animal mimicry is. Then when the professor starts giving examples, details, like Katie's grasshoppers, that's when you need to start taking your notes. Even if you don't know what those animals are, how to spell them, you just have to write whatever you think that, however you think they're spelled. For example, if we go to the first here.
Listen to part of a universe like something that is not good to eat, or something that is otherwise. Techniques and devices to protect themselves from their attackers in order to survive and in order to reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation.
All of that was the introduction, right? They explained what mimicry is and why animals use mimicry.
And one of these techniques, one of these strategies,
the professor says one of these techniques, one of these strategies, you already know that it's going to be the first type. One of the types of mimicry, one of the techniques, the first one.
is to look like something else, to look like something that is not good to eat, or something that is otherwise of no interest to the predator. An organism that does this, that resembles something else, is called a mimic. And the thing that it has evolved to resemble is called the model, while the predator that it is trying to mislead is called the recipient.
So those are specific terms, you should take notes on that. Because when you have specific details like those terms, you're not going to remember, right? The model, the recipient, the mimic, those are hard things to remember. But you can remember the big ideas, right? Okay, so you are picturing an animal that looks like something else. So those ideas you don't have to take notes, but the key details, that should be on your notes.
The one that receives the misleading image. Some mimics do this by adopting camouflage, which is a cryptic.
Right, so you take notes, you write down camouflage, and then you just pay attention to understand what camouflage is. You don't take any notes.
Resemblance to something of no interest to its enemy. And by doing this, they become invisible. They are hidden. Many animals, insects, lizards, amphibians, mimic the abundant plant life in the habitat around them. I'm sure that you've seen green grasshoppers and
that's where you start taking notes, right, with the examples. So it's always the same for all of the types. When you have classification, pay attention for the name, the type, the definition, the big ideas, you just hear them, and then the examples, you write them down. Okay, guys, so careful, that's really important, because you're very likely going to have one of these. So, and also remember, right, the questions normally go in order. So if you had to guess, then guess that they are going to go in order, that you will only have one question per idea, and choose the one that you think makes more sense according to the other questions as well. Even though you technically can see the other questions, right? You can see the question before or the question after. But you know the questions that have happened or that have been asked before. So if you already had a question for camouflage, you know that you're not going to have another one. Not likely. Okay, guys, so those are some tips that I can give you aside from what we already talked about. Is that okay? Do you have any questions so far?
No, miss.
Okay, guys, I think I already sent you this link. So let me call attendance, please. Another site, by the way, where you can hear good lectures is examenglish.com. And technically here you have practices for the reading and for all of the sections, reading, listening, speaking. But I would say that the lectures that you have here are useful, are very similar to the real ones. So I'm also gonna send you guys this link if you guys want to practice. And they are especially good for practicing your note taking because they have a lot of details. So I sent you the link. And if you guys don't have questions, then we're going to leave it here. We are done now with the listening section. We've seen both different question types, both conversations and lectures. I suggest you practice because believe me, it's all about practicing. Listening section is nothing else than practicing. Kind of the same as the reading, to be honest. And please don't forget to fill out today's survey. We will continue. We will be moving on to the speaking section actually next class. Okay, guys, thank you so much. I will be seeing you all next class. Have a great weekend.
Bye, Miss.
Bye-bye.